Welcome to a journey back in time, a time of neon lights and cassette tapes, a time when arcades buzzed, blockbuster movies redefined storytelling, and music pulsed through Walkmans across the globe. A time of bold fashion, big hair, and even bigger ideas. Welcome to the 1980s. In this narrated exploration, we'll uncover 5 fascinating facts about one of the most iconic decades in modern history. But this isn't just a list. It's a story. A story about innovation, culture, conflict, and transformation. So sit back, relax, and let's step into the electric world of the 1980s. If there's one thing the 1980s is remembered for above all else, it's pop culture. The decade didn't just produce trends, it created cultural phenomena that still influence us today. Let's start with music. The rise of MTV in 1981 changed everything. For the first time, music wasn't just something you listened to, it was something you watched. Artists had to think visually. Image became just as important as sound. Suddenly, music videos weren't optional, they were essential. This shift gave rise to a new kind of superstar. Artists who could not only sing, but perform, act, and captivate through visuals. Genres also exploded during this time. Pop, rock, hip-hop, and electronic music all gained major traction. Hip-hop, in particular, began emerging from underground scenes into mainstream consciousness. What started in neighborhoods in New York City began spreading across the country, and eventually, the world. Meanwhile, electronic sounds, driven by synthesizers, became the signature sound of the decade. But music was only part of the story. Movies in the 1980s became bigger, louder, and more ambitious. This was the decade that solidified the concept of the blockbuster. Studios realized that a single, massively successful film could dominate the box office and popular culture. Franchises were born. Sequels became the norm. Special effects advanced rapidly. Think about it. This was the era when audiences saw groundbreaking visual storytelling that pushed the limits of what was possible on screen. Television also evolved dramatically. Cable TV expanded, offering more channels and more specialized programming. Sitcoms, dramas, and animated shows became household staples. And then there were the toys. The 1980s saw the rise of toy lines that weren't just toys, they were brands. These brands often came with cartoons, comics, and merchandise, creating entire universes for kids to explore. For the first time, entertainment became deeply interconnected. Music influenced fashion, movies influenced toys, TV shows influenced everything. The 1980s didn't just create pop culture, it built the blueprint for how pop culture works today. The 1980s was a decade of technological awakening. It was the moment when the future began to feel real. Personal computers started entering homes. Before the 1980s, computers were massive machines used by governments, universities, and large corporations. But during this decade, they became something individuals could own. Suddenly, people could write documents, play games, and even learn programming, all from their own homes. This shift marked the beginning of the digital age. And while computers were evolving, so were gaming systems. Arcades were incredibly popular at the start of the decade. Bright lights, buzzing machines, and the sound of coins dropping created an atmosphere unlike anything else. But as the decade progressed, gaming moved into the living room. Home consoles allowed people to play video games without leaving their houses. This changed gaming forever. Gaming was no longer just a public activity, it became personal. Then came portable music. The introduction of the cassette-based portable music player allowed people to take their music anywhere. For the first time, individuals could create personal soundtracks for their daily lives. This might seem normal now, but at the time, it was revolutionary. Imagine being able to walk down the street while listening to your favorite songs whenever you wanted. It was freedom. The 1980s also saw advancements in telecommunications. Phones became more accessible and varied. Answering machines became common, allowing people to leave messages when someone wasn't home. Communication was becoming more flexible. And let's not forget about video technology. The rise of home video systems meant that people could watch movies whenever they wanted. No longer tied to theater schedules, audiences could build personal collections of films. This changed entertainment consumption forever. The 1980s didn't just introduce new technology, it changed how humans interacted with technology. It made technology personal. While pop culture and technology thrived, the 1980s was also a decade of intense global tension. At the heart of it all was the Cold War. This wasn't a traditional war with constant battles, it was a prolonged period of political and military rivalry between major world powers. And in the early 1980s, tensions were high. There was fear, real fear, of nuclear conflict. People built shelters. Governments invested heavily in defense systems. The possibility of global catastrophe loomed over everyday life. But something began to shift as the decade progressed. Leadership changes and diplomatic efforts started easing tensions. Dialogue replaced hostility. Agreements were made to reduce nuclear weapons. The idea of cooperation slowly began to replace confrontation. By the late 1980s, the Cold War was no longer escalating. It was winding down. This shift had profound effects. Countries that had been divided began to reconnect. Barriers, both physical and ideological, started to break down. The world was changing. The 1980s wasn't just a time of tension. It was a turning point, a decade where fear began to give way to hope. If you could describe 1980s fashion in one word, it would be this: bold. This was not a decade for subtlety. Bright colors dominated wardrobes. Neon pinks, electric blues, and vivid greens were everywhere. Clothing wasn't just about style, it was about making a statement. Shoulder pads became a defining feature, especially in professional attire. They created a powerful, structured silhouette. The message was clear: confidence. Athletic wear also became fashionable beyond the gym. Tracksuits, leg warmers, and sneakers became everyday clothing. Comfort and style merged in new ways. Hair was an entirely different story. Bigger was better. People spent hours styling their hair to achieve volume and height. Hairspray became a staple. Accessories were just as expressive. Chunky jewelry, oversized sunglasses, and bold makeup completed the look. But fashion in the 1980s wasn't just about appearance. It was about identity. Different groups embraced different styles. Music scenes influenced clothing choices. Subcultures developed unique looks that reflected their values and attitudes. Fashion became a form of self-expression like never before. It was loud, it was daring, and it was unforgettable. When we look back at the 1980s, it's easy to focus on the aesthetics, the music, the fashion, the entertainment. But beneath all of that, something deeper was happening. The foundations of the modern world were being built. Technology was becoming integrated into daily life. Global communication was expanding. Cultural exchange was accelerating. Ideas were spreading faster than ever before. The concept of globalization, where countries, cultures, and economies become interconnected, began gaining momentum. Business practices evolved. Media became more influential. Consumer culture expanded rapidly. Even the way people thought about the future changed. The 1980s was a decade of ambition. People believed in progress, in innovation, in pushing boundaries. And many of the systems, technologies, and cultural norms we rely on today have roots in this decade. The 1980s wasn't just a moment in time. It was a launchpad. So, what makes the 1980s so special? It was a decade of contrasts, innovation and tension, creativity and uncertainty, bold expression and cautious diplomacy. But above all, it was a decade of transformation. It reshaped entertainment. It redefined technology. It redirected global politics. And it reimagined what the future could look like. Even today, echoes of the 1980s are everywhere. In the music we hear, in the technology we use, in the culture we live in. The 1980s didn't just leave a mark, it changed the world. Thanks for joining this journey through the 1980s. And remember, every decade tells a story, but some change everything.